Moscow, 1936. Inside the Kremlin reigns one of history's bloodiest dictators, Stalin. His power is absolute. He announces the results of the 1936 elections. 98.6% of the ballots. He's merciless, asking his people to sacrifice their blood. His subjects live in fear. Like in a ritual, they're forced to shower the tyrant with endless rounds of applause. Stalin feigns impatience. He pulls out his watch. In the audience, Vasily Petrovich Nikolaev recalls. The comrades look around at each other. No one wants to be the first to stop applauding. I don't know why, but I sit back down. 2 days later, he is arrested, thrown in jail, beaten, and tortured. But his faith in communism never wavers. Why? Stalin and his accomplices have fabricated a planetary lie, built on the foundations of his past and his crimes. To this day, the lie continues to poison many minds. Behind this lie lurks the apocalypse.
All right. Very long documentary on Stalin, but a very well-made documentary. So if you want, I wouldn't call it a definitive documentary on Stalin, but it is one of the better ones. All right, this slide right here just kind of shows the bureaucratic makeup of the Soviet Union, how it was organized. In kind of a simple terms, I mean, you have it broken up to the Communist Party. You have the bureaucracy that runs the country, the government, and then you have the legislative branch. And what I'm trying to get you to understand with all this is that um, it was basically all in the same, even though they broke it up into these different little pieces. You had your Communist Party running everything. You had the government, which was basically Communist Party members. And then, like you said, you had your legislative branch, once again, Communist Party members. So even if you were members of the party, or if you were members of the executive branch or of the legislative branch, you were all part and parcel of the same body. Okay, so sometimes the leader of the Soviet Union was referred to as general secretary. Sometimes that person was also referred to as the premier. And from time to time, they're also referred to as the president. I always found that quite confusing as a kid, as I was learning about the Soviet Union as a young person. But anyways, what you need to understand is that decisions were made from the top, through advice from experts, etc. And then those decisions were filtered down to the masses, eventually getting down to the citizens. So essentially, all of this was a way to legitimize your party. How do you legitimize your party? Well, you have members of the party belong to both executive and legislative departments within government. All right, this is the theoretical structure of the Communist Party, where, after a revolution and that period of dictatorship, the proletariat occur, then after time, you're going to have this kind of kumbaya, everyone's working together kind of thing, where, you can look at the bottom there, everyone's a member, and then it kind of filters up to the All Union Party Congress, eventually filtering up to the so-called Central Committee. And then from that Central Committee, you have the higher ups, the so-called oligarchy that's running the country, called the Politburo, the Secretariat that carries out the government decisions, and all that. So this is the theoretical structure of the Communist Party. Okay. And it was, in theory, it was a bottom-up kind of a thing, where the people would decide, what's going on, because the government would work in the best interest of the people. This here is also in your textbook, is an explanation of how it really worked, because once again, they never went beyond the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where the government had to guide and direct how people were to behave and act. In theory, under Marx's theory, eventually that the state itself would wither away, and pure communism would be, would reign supreme in a country. As you can see here, the state centralized government would control all aspects of people's lives, ranging from their education to communication, censorship, how items were distributed. Okay, so it was centrally planned, centrally run, etc. The people would be the muscle, all the workers. Okay, everyone would work. In theory, there'd be complete equality, at least among the proletariat. Okay. The proletariat would contribute labor, both physical labor and mental labor, in the areas of land and agriculture. And in industry, the state would tell the proletariat what to do. They would exert control in both these areas, land and agriculture and industry. And like I said, at some point along the way, this would no longer be necessary. The state itself would no longer be necessary. The proletariat would be sufficiently educated enough that they would need the guidance of the state, and it would wither away. It never happened. Okay, from series of events after events after events, the state had to continue to control its population, and often in a very brutal manner. All right, I'm not showing these clips. These come from a TV movie based on the life of Stalin. Stalin was ruthless. As you'll see in the video clips that I've shown you, he was a lot of times the guy that would do the dirty work, especially when he was younger. But before he became leader of the Soviet Union, he worked under Lenin. And like I said, he was not overly liked by a lot of people within the Politburo, within the higher ups of the organization, particularly Trotsky. But Stalin had a way of allying people that he needed at the time around himself. Okay, he was a very shrewd politician in that way. He didn't have the same kind of charisma, say, like a Hitler had or a Mussolini, but like I said, he was a master organizer. He could work behind the scenes, and he eventually was able to outmaneuver all his rivals and become the leader of the Soviet Union after the death of Lenin. But anyways, like I said, TV movie starring Robert Duvall. Once again, if you're into watching historically based movies like that, it's a pretty good movie. All right, upon Lenin's death, and one of the things that you'll see in a dictatorship over and over again, there isn't this smooth and easy transition of power from one person to another. So there was a basic number of years power struggle that ensued. Eventually, Stalin won out over people like Leon Trotsky. Now in power, let me just move my. Stalin wanted to continue to transform Soviet society into a true communist state. So he was going to reject Lenin's NEP policy that instituted some aspects of the market economy. So he went against that. Economically, when we think of Stalin, we think of the 5-year plans. We think of agriculturally forced collectivization. So here's some propaganda posters based on collectivization. The smoke of chimneys is the breath of Soviet Russia. Stalin wanted to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial state, one which was strong enough to stand up and defend its independence against other countries instead of suffering humiliating defeats. Stalin aimed to modernize and develop the Soviet Union into a great country more powerful than the USA and Britain, not just through industrialization, but rapid industrialization. The Soviet Union's economy became a planned economy, or in this aspect, a command economy, where the government commands how things are to be run and operated. They'll institute deadlines and quotas and goals, etc. Stalin, in a 1931 speech to factory managers explaining the need for industrialization. I need to sip a thing here before I give this speech. Tsarist Russia suffered many defeats because of her backwardness. All those countries defeated her because she was weak. This is why we must no longer lag behind. Do we want our motherland to be defeated and lose our independence? If you do not want this, you must put an end to backwardness in the shortest possible time. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must catch up in 10 years or they will crush us. Some more propaganda. That said, under the leadership of the great Stalin, forward to communism. Okay. So, what was the impact of industrialization with these 5-year plans? Stalin managed to survive the initial problems faced in his industrialization programs. Initially, due to the focus on heavy industries, iron ore, steel, etc., industries that produced basic goods were neglected. The living and working conditions of Russians improved, however, considerably after 1935. With his 5-year plans, the Soviet Union's heavy industries expanded rapidly and production of consumer goods eventually increased. So we're going to look at some viewpoints about what was going on at this time. Basically, however, if you spoke out against Stalin in any way, you were probably either killed or sent to some sort of gulag. So more than likely, a lot of people didn't really speak the truth. All right, so here's a viewpoint of a Russian worker. The working conditions here are terrible. Yet all of us are working hard and not complaining. Well, you better not be complaining because you're going to be sent to a gulag. Russia has gone through so many difficulties. We want to build a new Russia for our children. They should not go through what we have gone through. And they probably will, because there's a world war coming. Even our women work as hard as the men. There's another perspective from a factory owner. We have always depended on the countries in Western Europe for our industrial goods. That might have been okay in the past, but things are different now because we are a communist country. What will happen to Russia if they refuse to sell their goods to us? We have no choice but to build our own factories and steelworks as fast as possible. What was going on is, since they were communist, the other countries of Europe were a little bit more reticent or hesitant to sell them products. And here's a last viewpoint. A member of the Communist Party recalling in the 1930s, it was a time of great deeds. Stalin was able to keep discovering new challenges, and we look to the future as if, what a bunch of malarkey. Okay, obviously that dude did not want to get sent to a gulag, but yes, he's buttering up the old leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's reasons for collectivization. If farming methods were improved, fewer people would be needed to work the land. This meant that some of the people in the countryside would be able to move to the cities to work in the factories. The farmers would be able to grow more crops. The Soviet Union would be able to sell the extra crops to other countries. The profit it earned could be used to pay for the building of new factories. Bigger plots of land, modern farming machinery equaled greater productivity. Okay, it's not unlike what we saw a little bit with the agricultural revolution that occurred in England and other places in Europe, a couple hundred years earlier. Initially, Stalin used reason and persuasion to try to garner the farmers' support in joining collective farms. That doesn't always work. And so sometimes when reason and persuasion don't work, then you just go to force. All right, so here's a viewpoint from a landless Russian peasant, so a poor peasant. This idea sounds good. With collectivization, by the way, I'm not doing my Russian voice anymore because it hurts. I will be a co-owner of the land and I will get what the other peasants with land get. Always the people that don't have seem to like the communist ideals. However, a Russian peasant who rents the land he works on says this is a good idea. We no longer need to pay absurdly high rent to work on the land. So if you're a landowner, do you think you like this collectivization? Probably not. A rich peasant says, in the past, we got high prices for selling our crops. That was fair given the amount of effort and time we spent in the fields. However, with collectivization, we will have to sell our produce at a very low price to the government. So they don't like this idea. They're going to lose a lot of money. They're going to be more like some of the people that either had to rent or had no land themselves. Another Russian peasant sent to work on a collective farm stated, it sounds fine for those who work hard, but what about those who are lazy? Why should we share our hard earned money with them? One of the main weaknesses of communism in general is that it doesn't account for the concept of hard work, doesn't account for the concept of accountability, of motivation, etc. Okay, it's just automatically believing that you're going to work hard for the benefit of the collective themselves, not for internal motivation. Voluntary collectivization did not work because many farmers did not want to abandon their traditional way of life. The so-called kulaks, I think that term is a pejorative, but they were the richer peasant farmers, did not want to give up their land. And they spoke out against it, okay, even against what Stalin had wanted with these propaganda posters. If you remember Social 20, you learned about the Ukrainian Holodomor. And one of the things that occurred during this time period is that Stalin wanted to get rid of overt nationalism that was occurring in some of these areas, especially Ukraine. And so this forced collectivization was in a way in which he could destroy their overt nationalism. Because of this, Stalin adopted a policy of collectivization by force. So by 1929, Stalin ordered the first five-year plan decreeing Soviet agriculture to be collectivized by the end of 33. Many farmers, kulaks included, resisted. Stalin responded by ordering 17 million horses used in farming to be killed so that the farmers would be forced to use tractors instead. However, there were not enough tractors to replace the horses that had been killed. I mean, obviously, the switch over, the transition between traditional forms of agriculture and this more modern form of agriculture, there's going to be a lot of people dying. Okay. But Stalin, famous for saying one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Reluctant landowners were accused of being class enemies, rich kulaks exploiting the masses. And so one of the things that Stalin would do is he would turn one group of people against another. So he turned the poorer people against the kulaks, thus setting the stage for Stalin's decree in December 29 to liquidate. Liquidate means to get rid of the kulaks as a class. Famine historians estimated between 7 to 10 million people died, okay, as victims of forced starvation, torture, rape, and murder. This is Stalin addressing the Communist Party in 1929. For the most part, I'm not going to read in Russian, but for Stalin, I make an exception. The kulaks are the sworn enemy of the collective farm movement. We are to eliminate them as a class. We must break down the resistance of the kulaks and deprive them of their resistant existence. We must smash them. We must strike at the kulaks so hard as to prevent them from rising to their feet again. I hope some people are actually watching this video. All right, so that was the elimination of the kulaks, but Stalin also had to eliminate his political opposition. Due to the famine of 32-33, the drive to industrialization and strict controls over the populace, many people within the Soviet Union started to question the leadership of Joseph Stalin. I mean, obviously, people will question your leadership when you start killing millions of people. Okay. Stalin didn't need that kind of questioning to be suspicious. He was suspicious to begin with. If you ever took my psychology class, you would understand that Stalin was more than likely either a psychopath or a sociopath. While Stalin felt it necessary to imprison or execute dissenters, most of the members of the Politburo, the so-called oligarchy running the Communist Party, still argued against some of his, well, at least maybe not openly, but privately. So this instituted at some point the event called the Great Purge. A purge is to get rid of a group, of something, an entity. I encourage you to watch some of these videos. Once again, absolutely fascinating how evil and dark this time was in the Soviet Union. Many of the old Bolsheviks were either executed or exiled to gulags, work camps, they went abroad, etc. And what I mean by the old Bolsheviks, I'm talking about the people that were in the Soviet Union at its inception, okay? People that really knew Joseph Stalin before he became the great leader. Most high-ranking members of the Red Army, the military, were executed or exiled. Once again, you're chopping the proverbial head off your military. No wonder they weren't so ready to fight in World War II when the Nazis invaded in June of 1941. Between 1.5 and 2 million Soviet citizens were arrested for counter-revolutionary activities, and about 50% of those were executed. Stalin would just draw up lists, well, not so much him, but I mean people that worked for him, and people would be arbitrarily executed without trial, without a crime. Okay, a lot of times it was just basic quotas to be met. Okay, you would just be suspect. I mean, this is very similar to when you look at the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution. Same type of principle. You want to weaken enemies. You want to get rid of dissent. You want to keep people scrambling and uneasy, so to speak. All right. A lot of times people were sent to these prison work camps. No wonder things industrialized very quickly. Things switched over in the Soviet Union fairly quickly in the 1930s, is because they had millions of free labor, slave labor. A couple videos, like I said, feel free to watch these on um, one of the most famous works of literature on this time period, the so-called Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Okay, once again, I've read a bit of it. Hopefully sometime in my life I'll just sit down and read all of it, but just shocking some of the things that went on in these work camps and some of the ways and reasons in which people were put into these camps. Here's just a location of all these gulags located throughout the Soviet Union. You can literally see hundreds of them. All right, when we look at methods that dictators will use to keep and secure power, another one is controlled participation. Okay, elections in the Soviet Union were held, but candidates were chosen by local Communist Party leaders. Non-communists could stand for election if they were approved by the party. Voting. During the 1920s and 30s, voting was performed by raising the hand, not by a secret ballot. In 1936, Soviet voters were allowed to vote by a secret ballot. The ballot contained only candidates approved by the Communist Party. The Communist Party used propaganda to convince the Soviet population about the superiority of communism over the democratic capitalist West. It also utilized propaganda to glorify its leader, a so-called cult of personality. Stalin was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was Stalin. Okay, this whole idea of cult of personalities, you make the leader like a god. And once again, the Soviet Union, just like any dictatorship, was rife with propaganda, basically saying that the capitalists were swindlers, etc. And then you got Grandpa Venerable Grandpa Joe, kind, perfect looking, great around kids, Grandpa Joe. One of the things they did back then is that they did a lot of airbrushing and getting rid of people that went against the regime. Okay, you'll notice with this first picture, you have Lenin in the center, and then uh, to the right, his left, so to speak, that would be Trotsky. But then Trotsky, when he fell out of favor, was basically airbrushed out of Soviet history. Here's another example. Lenin giving a speech, you have Trotsky down on the side, and then once again, Trotsky was eliminated from history. And they did that all the time. Lenin in 1920, only by radically remolding the teaching, organization, and training of the youth shall we be able to ensure that the efforts of the younger generation will result in the creation of society that will be unlike the old society, the creation of a communist society. All right. Communists had tight control over culture, education. People were controlled in what they were taught. History was changed to focus on the importance of Lenin and Stalin. Stalin was shown as having played a key role in the October 1917 revolution. Other leaders were either ignored or unfairly presented. Discipline was had in schools. Teachers were watched closely, and they were gotten rid of if they spoke out against Stalin. The arts. Only writers, artists, and musicians who made art praising Stalin and his program could remain in their jobs. Writings, paintings, and music was expected to act as propaganda for the regime. Okay, as a result of this, it destroyed invention. It destroyed, or at least it hurt innovation. And so you didn't have a huge amount of variety, and there wasn't a huge amount of progression in that area during that time period. Obviously, they used terror, force, and fear. I talked about the purges. I talked about what they did to the kulaks, the military leaders. One of the first acts of the Bolsheviks after the 1917 revolution was to set up a secret police force. I previously mentioned this group called the Cheka to assist the Communist Party to establish control over the country. This police force had the power to arrest, imprison, and execute opponents of the Communist Party without trial. Under Stalin, this secret police had become a massive public security apparatus that not only controlled political opponents, but ordinary citizens that showed any dissent towards the Communist Party or its leader. Okay, so once again, if you were unlucky during that time period, or you spoke out against the regime, or you did anything, you were gotten rid of. Okay, and this would be examples of the NKVD that came after the Cheka. Okay, you got the Czech in 1920, eventually became the NKVD in 1934, and then eventually became the KGB by the middle of the 1950s. This poor sap is saying, I demand the rule of law. And of course, these guys are saying, hasta la vista. Actually, no, that's Spanish. They would say something in Russian. To end off today, on Netflix, there's a movie called The Death of Stalin. And once again, it's probably like a PG-13, etc. kind of thing. But it is a decent movie that kind of goes through in a very tongue-in-cheek fashion. It's an irreverent look at how people scrambled around Stalin, and then subsequently after his death, how they maneuvered to try to gain favor and win out over others. It is on Netflix. I do recommend it as far as uh, a movie to watch. However, I would remind you that you might want to look at the Internet Movie Database. Look at there's a lot of swearing. Uh, it's quite irreverent, but it is a well-made movie about this time period. How people were absolutely afraid of Stalin. Uh, would go to great extremes to do whatever he asked to do. And you'll see, after his death, how people scrambled to try to gain upon their opponents or their rivals, so to speak. So, anyways, I think I'll end off today's lesson at that point. Maybe I'll finish off the rest of this little thing tomorrow, but I think that's going to be it for today. Bye bye.